August 6th, 1945, 08:15 hours. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, the air inside the concrete bunker felt heavy, dense with the fatigue of a nation unraveling. The Imperial General Headquarters had long been a world of dim lights, faint whispers, and the slow, grinding rhythm of defeat. But that morning, everything changed. A single decoded message, brief, fragmented, almost incoherent, shattered 3 years of illusions about the nature of modern war. What the Japanese High Command read on that transmission from Hiroshima forced them to face a truth they had buried beneath rhetoric and ritual. America had not been fighting at full strength. They had been holding back. 90 feet underground, surrounded by walls 4 feet thick, the war room pulsed with the steady hum of machinery and the murmurs of men who no longer believed in victory, yet were forbidden to speak of loss. Field Marshal Shinroku Hata's morning intelligence briefing began, as it always did, with the weary recital of casualty figures, factory shortages, and hollow reassurances about strategic regrouping. It was an exercise in denial, one that everyone understood, but no one dared to interrupt. Until at precisely 08:15, Lieutenant Colonel Tishi Yamamoto burst through the heavy steel door, breaking protocol, breathless and pale. He didn't bow. He simply held out a single-coded dispatch, his voice trembling. The words that followed would change everything. Entire city destroyed by single bomb. Blast radius exceeds all previous bombardment. Unknown weapon type. Casualties catastrophic. Request immediate. The message ended mid-sentence, swallowed by static. General Yoshiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial General Staff, read the message once, then again, and again. His eyes, normally cold and deliberate, flickered with something between disbelief and dread. His first thought was logical, a massive B-29 raid, perhaps 500 aircraft striking simultaneously. That at least was possible. But Hiroshima was vast, a city of 350,000 souls spread across 27 square miles. No conventional bombardment could have erased it in moments, yet reports continued to arrive through the morning, each one worse than the last. Weather reconnaissance confirmed only 3 B-29s over Hiroshima that morning. 3 aircraft, not 300. Admiral Soamu Toyota stood before the wall-sized operational map, his face carved in shadow by the flickering lamps. Every known American squadron, every fleet movement, every supply convoy, all were marked there with obsessive precision. His staff knew the patterns of American warfare down to the hour. They knew how bomber streams formed, what tonnage they carried, how long cities burned. Nothing in 3 years of war had prepared them for this. By Tengus hours, reconnaissance flights were reporting something impossible, a column of smoke and light rising higher than any mountain in Japan. Pilots described a mushroom cloud reaching 40,000 feet, glowing like a living thing, purples, oranges, and reds folding into one another, pulsing as if the sky itself had caught fire. At 11:30, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the first civilian eyewitness report, a railway official who had been 15 miles outside the city. His words, recorded by Togo's secretary, carried the trembling rhythm of a man who had seen something beyond comprehension. A flash, brighter than 1,000 suns. Then wind, the wind that crushed everything. The trains jumped off their rails. He said the heart of Hiroshima had vanished. In its place, an inferno raged, a storm of light visible from the distant hills. By 14 Nux, the Supreme War Council met in the underground chamber. No one spoke at first. The air was thick with the weight of realization. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, his hands unsteady, placed the reports before him. "Gentlemen," he began softly, "we must consider what this means." General Korochika Anami, the Minister of War, leaned forward, his voice like gravel. American propaganda. They wish us to believe they possess weapons they do not have. His tone was defiant, but his eyes betrayed doubt. Hiroshima was destroyed by incendiaries. They claim otherwise to crush our morale. Admiral Toyota broke the silence, something he would never normally dare to do. 3 aircraft, Anami-san, he said, his voice flat. Our radar tracked them. Our observers confirmed them. 3. And for a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The implications hung in the room like ash. For 3 years, Japanese strategy had rested on a single idea, that American industry, though vast, could be neutralized by Japanese willpower, that spirit, discipline, and sacrifice could overcome steel, oil, and machines. When American shipyards launched a dozen vessels for every one Japan built, they said it didn't matter. One Japanese sailor had the heart of 10. When the United States rolled aircraft off its assembly lines faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them, Japanese commanders consoled themselves that their pilots possessed unmatched courage. It was a story they told to stay sane. But now, the story had broken. A single bomb, one weapon dropped by one plane, had erased an entire city. It was no longer a matter of courage. It was mathematics. It was physics. It was the end of everything they thought they understood. Colonel Hideaki Sato, the quiet man who led Japan's industrial intelligence section, spoke next. His tone was calm, but every word landed like a hammer. Since 1941, we have measured American production. The numbers do not lie. He looked down at his notes. 88,000 tanks, 41 carriers, hundreds of destroyers. Cargo ships launched faster than German U-boats could sink them. He paused. But this... He pointed to the message from Hiroshima. This is beyond quantity. If the Americans can destroy a city with one bomb, then their science has escaped the limits of war as we know it. We are fighting an enemy who now bends the laws of nature. The silence that followed was longer than before. Foreign Minister Togo finally said what everyone feared to think. And if they have one such bomb, he whispered, we must assume they have more. Heads turned. Some men nodded faintly, others stared into the table. The last refuge of denial was crumbling. For years, Japan's high command had comforted itself with a set of beliefs, myths built not on data, but on pride. That the Americans were soft, that industrial power could not replace fighting spirit, that Japan's divine mission would compensate for material weakness. Those illusions had held the empire together, even as its cities burned, its navy sank, and its sons died by the thousands. But the truth had now come in the form of light, blinding, absolute, undeniable. To understand that moment, one must look back to the beginning, to the voice of one man who had foreseen this outcome years before anyone listened. In November 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, had issued a warning so precise it read like prophecy. His words, preserved in naval staff minutes, were simple. I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, I have no confidence. Yamamoto had studied in America. He had walked the streets of Boston, stood beneath the smokestacks of Detroit, and watched the endless movement of trains, factories, and steel. He understood the United States not as an enemy of spirit, but as a machine of unimaginable power, a nation where industry itself was a weapon. Yamamoto knew what his peers refused to see. America's steel production alone dwarfed Japan's entire industrial base. Its oil reserves were beyond calculation. He had seen the Mississippi River carrying barges heavy with ore and grain, feeding factories that ran day and night. And he had told them, not once, but many times, that war against such an adversary could only end one way. But his warnings had been dismissed by the same men now staring at the destruction of Hiroshima. They had chosen to believe in something else, a fantasy that discipline could replace resources, and devotion could replace machines. Even then, in the flickering light of that bunker, surrounded by charts and maps that now meant nothing, some still clung to the illusion. General Anami pressed his palms to the table. "If America has this weapon," he said, "then surrender would mean humiliation beyond measure. Better to die standing than live crawling." Admiral Toyota turned away, his voice almost weary. "And if dying means nothing, if every city becomes another Hiroshima?" The men did not answer. They could not. Somewhere above them, Tokyo's air raid sirens wailed faintly in the afternoon heat. The war was ending, though no one yet dared to say it aloud. Outside, the late summer sun burned through the haze. A single message, carried across the airwaves, had torn open the heart of an empire. In the days that followed, other transmissions would come, from Nagasaki, from American radio broadcasts, from the ashes of cities that no longer existed. But in that room, at that hour, for those men who had built their lives around the myth of invincibility, it all ended with the sound of silence and the faint hum of the bunker lights flickering against the concrete walls. The sound of a world realizing it had already lost. American strategists had long assumed that industrial strength alone could decide the outcome of war. But within the chambers of Tokyo's Supreme War Council, that same power was viewed through a lens of faith and defiance, something to be outwitted, not matched. Japan's senior commanders believed that America's vast factories, its endless assembly lines of bombers and ships, could be neutralized by three unshakable pillars: distance, morale, and tactical superiority. On paper, it sounded almost plausible. In spirit, it was doctrine. And for nearly 4 years, it was a doctrine no one dared to question. The first pillar was distance. Japan's empire stretched across the Pacific like a vast defensive curtain, from the Aleutians to the Dutch East Indies. The High Command believed this perimeter would make the war unwinnable for any foreign invader. American supply lines, they argued, would strangle themselves under their own length. Every bullet, every tank, every gallon of fuel would have to cross 5,000 miles of hostile ocean, while Japan resupplied itself from nearby conquests. "America will tire," the strategists wrote. "We will not." It was a comforting illusion, one that would later collapse beneath the relentless hum of U.S. logistics ships moving with clockwork precision across the Pacific. The second pillar was morale. To the Japanese High Command, the United States was a nation of comfort and commerce, soft, individualistic, incapable of enduring real loss. They believed American democracy could not survive heavy casualties, that public outrage, not battlefield defeat, would end the war. The logic was chillingly simple. Japan's willingness to die would outlast America's willingness to fight. The projections even had numbers. 30 or 40,000 American deaths, they thought, would break the U.S. will. They never imagined that number would multiply tenfold without breaking it. The third pillar was tactical superiority. Japanese forces, they insisted, possessed a warrior spirit that transcended machinery. Their soldiers, honed by discipline and ritual, would fight with such precision and ferocity that one Japanese infantryman could equal 3 or 4 Americans in combat effectiveness. Technology could be copied, factories rebuilt, but spirit could not. This belief, inherited from centuries of samurai, tradition gave Japanese soldiers extraordinary resolve and blinded their leaders to modern reality. Each of these assumptions would be tested and shattered across every battlefield of the Pacific. At Midway, in June 1942, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were lost in a single day. The official report blamed unfortunate timing, bad weather, and luck. Few dared to mention the true cause. American cryptographers had cracked Japan's naval codes. Even then, The high command refused to question the foundation of their doctrine. "We lost by chance," they said, "not by weakness." At Guadalcanal, from August 1942 to February 1943, the illusion of distance collapsed completely. The Americans, whom Japanese analysts had deemed logistically incapable, somehow sustained an entire campaign across thousands of miles of ocean. Supply ships came and went like clockwork. Food, ammunition, reinforcements, all arrived when needed. Japanese troops, by contrast, starved in the jungle, their lines cut, their morale eroding beneath tropical rain. Yet again, Tokyo's post-battle analysis found fault not with strategy, but with insufficient fighting spirit. To question the doctrine itself was to commit heresy. By August 1945, every assumption had been quietly demolished by the weight of reality. But none of it had been spoken aloud, not in any official record, not in any council meeting. That afternoon, for the first time since the war began, the Supreme War Council was forced to confront what they had long avoided. Intelligence Colonel Hideaki Sato, a man known for his calm, almost mathematical precision, stood before them with what he called a reality assessment. It was a report 6 months in the making, long suppressed by censors, now unsealed by necessity. The numbers were merciless. In 1944 alone, American aircraft production had exceeded Japan's total output for the entire war. 1 year versus 4. Their shipyards were launching escort carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from them. U.S. ammunition plants produced more shells in a week than Japan's factories could in a month. Sato's words were quiet, measured, but the silence in the room deepened with every statistic. Then came the final blow: scientific research. His intelligence team had tracked the American buildup for years, vast laboratories, entire cities devoted to innovation. "Our records show," Sato said, "that the United States employs over 130,000 scientists and engineers on military research. Japan, roughly 6,000. His voice faltered slightly. "Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, Chicago. Each of these universities has more physicists than our nation's entire scientific establishment." And then, in a sentence that no one in that bunker would ever forget, Sato explained what the atomic bomb truly meant. "This weapon," he said softly, "requires facilities we could not have built even if we had known how. The Americans constructed entire cities, Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos, to create a single weapon. They consumed more electricity than Tokyo. They spent more money than our entire war budget. We were never fighting the same kind of war." Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, his voice trembling, asked the question that would echo through tribunals and history books alike. "How could we not know?" Sato hesitated. "We did know, Foreign Minister. Our intelligence services reported American expansion. We intercepted communications about their scientific projects. We documented recruitment efforts for physicists and engineers. But every report was dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. We chose not to know, because knowing would mean accepting defeat." A long pause followed. The air felt heavy, almost still. Then Admiral Toyota spoke, his tone hollow and bitter. "The Americans fought this war with one hand tied behind their back. They fought Germany and Japan at once, while building weapons we could not even imagine. They produced more war material than we thought physically possible, and yet their civilian economy grew. They are not simply stronger than us. They belong to another civilization." That admission, that America represented not just greater power, but an entirely different order of capability, marked a profound shift in Japanese thought. For 4 years, their propaganda had painted the enemy as materialistic, weak, enslaved by machines. But Hiroshima had torn that illusion apart. In a single flash of light, the myth of spiritual superiority was gone. That evening, Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakomizu, wrote in his diary, "We have been fighting an enemy we never understood. We assumed they thought as we thought, that their limits were our limits. Hiroshima has proven that we were blind." The next morning, August 7th, dawned beneath a haze of disbelief. Reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched over Hiroshima, their pilots ordered to document what remained. Major Tsunete Kitamura, flying one of the first successful missions, reported weather phenomena unlike anything he had encountered in his career. Updrafts so violent, they threw his aircraft 2,000 feet upward in seconds. Instrument panels flickering from heat distortion, and a shimmering haze that stretched into the stratosphere. When his photographs were developed by 11 hot hours, no one could quite comprehend what they showed. The city's heart, roughly 4 square miles, had been wiped clean. Not reduced to rubble, not burned to ashes, but flattened, as though erased by an invisible hand. Buildings had not fallen, they had vanished. The analysts described it in clinical terms: complete structural loss, total urban void. But the images said more than any words could. Nothing recognizable remained. Military analysts compared the photographs to previous firebombing raids. The most devastating of all, the Tokyo firestorm of March 9-10, 1945, had required 334 B-29s, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiaries over 3 hours. Hiroshima's destruction exceeded that by a wide margin, and it had been done by a single aircraft, a single bomb, in an instant. When the Supreme War Council reconvened at 14 hours that day, the mood was unlike any before. The air was thick with resignation, the sense that something irreversible had been unleashed. And then came the message from Moscow. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had summoned Japan's ambassador, Naotake Sato, to the Kremlin at midnight. The meeting lasted only minutes. The message was curt and devastating. The Soviet Union was declaring war. In that moment, every calculation that had sustained Japan's war effort, every belief about endurance, distance, and morale, disintegrated. The walls of the underground chamber seemed to close in as realization spread across the faces of men who had once believed themselves immortal. Above them, the sky over Tokyo remained eerily clear, the summer cicadas humming without pause. And somewhere far to the west, over the ashes of Hiroshima, a pale column of smoke still twisted silently toward the heavens, the shape of a world that could never go back. The Soviet Union would consider itself officially at war with Japan as of August 9th, 1945. That single announcement, a few lines of diplomatic formality, was like a thunderclap in a sealed chamber. It shattered Japan's last fragile illusion of strategic hope. For months, even as Tokyo burned and the home islands trembled under the steady rhythm of B-29 raids, Japan's diplomats had worked tirelessly in secret, pleading for Soviet mediation. They imagined that Stalin, distrustful of his Western allies and forever scheming for advantage, might help broker a compromise, perhaps allowing Japan to retain part of its empire, or at least avoid occupation. But now that hope was gone, extinguished in an instant. The Red Army was coming. The empire was out of options. Witnesses said that when General Anemi, the fierce minister of war, heard the Soviet declaration, his face went pale, the color draining, as if the weight of a lifetime's conviction had suddenly turned to ash. Japan was now surrounded on every side: atomic fire from the east, Soviet divisions from the north, British Commonwealth forces pressing from the south, and a resurgent China reclaiming its occupied land. The vast empire that once stretched from India's borders to the mid-Pacific was now being crushed inward, like steel under a hydraulic press, toward its own heart, the home islands. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo broke the silence that followed. His voice, calm but brittle, carried the simple arithmetic of despair. We have 3 choices: surrender unconditionally, Fight until every city is destroyed by atomic weapons, or fight until both Soviets and American forces invade, and Japan ceases to exist as a nation. There are no other options. By August 8th, fragmentary intelligence confirmed the next blow. The Red Army had begun its assault on Manchuria, an invasion planned with surgical precision and executed with overwhelming force. In a single day, the mighty Kwantung Army, once the jewel of Japan's military power, was being dismantled piece by piece. Soviet tank columns advanced 50 miles in the first 24 hours, their momentum irresistible. The Japanese defenders, exhausted and under-equipped, collapsed before armies hardened in the crucible of the European War, men who had helped crush the Wehrmacht itself. And then came a deeper humiliation, one that no amount of valor could conceal. Intelligence reports revealed that much of the Soviet advance was being carried out using American-built trucks, jeeps, and radios, all supplied through Lend-Lease. The realization was devastating. American industry had not only armed its own massive forces across 2 oceans, but had also equipped its allies to fight with equal power. A single U.S. program, Lend-Lease, had delivered more material aid to the Soviets than Japan's total industrial output for the entire war. The empire was being defeated, quite literally, by machines stamped, "Made in America." At 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, the unimaginable repeated itself. Nagasaki vanished in a flash that turned the sky white. The message that came through from the city's regional command was brief, almost mechanical. Second atomic attack, city destroyed, casualties catastrophic. Then, silence. That afternoon, the Supreme War Council met again in what would become one of the most extraordinary sessions in Japanese military history. The protocol of composure, the careful bows, the studied calm, evaporated. For the first time, High Command spoke openly of defeat. Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, a man known for his restraint, broke that silence. His words were stark. The Americans have demonstrated that they can destroy our cities at will, one after another, until nothing remains. They can continue indefinitely. We cannot defend against weapons we cannot even detect. Our anti-aircraft guns are useless. Our fighters cannot intercept what they cannot find. Civil defense is meaningless. Across the table, General Yoshijiro Umezu, the chief of staff, added his voice, something that only weeks earlier would have been unthinkable. The atomic bomb changes everything, he said quietly. Concentrated forces become targets. Cities become targets. Our entire defensive doctrine, fighting to the last citizen, depends on the enemy needing to invade. But if they can destroy us without setting foot on Japanese soil, then our defense means nothing. They can erase Japan entirely. That night, intelligence officers delivered their estimates. The United States likely possessed between 3 and 7 additional atomic bombs with the capacity to produce more in the months ahead. Even if the figure was exaggerated, the logic remained unshakable. One bomb had leveled Hiroshima, another had leveled Nagasaki, a third could destroy Tokyo. Whether America had 7 or just 1, continued resistance was suicide. Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakomizu recorded the emperor's private words that evening, a rare moment of unfiltered truth from a man long shrouded in silence. His Majesty, he wrote, expressed that the unendurable must be endured. The atomic bombs have shown that continued resistance will mean the annihilation of the Japanese people. We must accept terms that preserve the nation, even if those terms are painful beyond measure. The unendurable must be endured. Those words would echo through history, not as rhetoric, but as resignation. They became the cornerstone of Japan's surrender announcement. Yet between that quiet imperial acknowledgement and the final act of surrender lay one last storm, a struggle between those who saw reason and those who still clung to ruin in the name of honor. On August 10th, Japan transmitted its first formal offer of surrender through Swiss diplomatic channels. The message accepted the Potsdam Declaration, but with one condition: the emperor's sovereignty must be preserved. The reply from Washington arrived 2 days later, carefully phrased to leave just enough room for interpretation. The emperor, it stated, would be subject to the authority of the supreme commander of the Allied powers, and his ultimate status would depend upon the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. That single line, a masterstroke of diplomatic ambiguity, ignited the final crisis. To some, it meant Japan could still keep its emperor as a figurehead. To others, it meant the emperor might face trial or even removal. General Anami and the military hardliners saw only humiliation. We cannot accept, they argued, better to die as warriors than live as slaves. Their resistance no longer came from any belief in victory. It was about preserving honor, or at least the illusion of it. But by mid-August, the numbers and the truth were inescapable. The will to fight, so long sustained by ideology, began to dissolve under the sheer gravity of fact. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Manchuria, each name now a synonym for futility. By August 16th, the transformation was complete. Japan's leaders were no longer debating how to win, but how to survive as a people. The formal surrender ceremony took place weeks later, on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. That morning, Tokyo Bay lay still beneath a pale, unbroken sky. The air was heavy with the weight of an ending. As the launch carrying the Japanese delegation approached the American battleship, the delegates looked up in stunned silence. The harbor was filled, horizon to horizon, with American warships, hundreds of V's. Them, steel towers bristling with antennas, guns, and flags. Overhead, aircraft circled in vast formations, their shadows crossing the water like migrating birds. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who signed the surrender document on behalf of Japan, later wrote in his diary, "The Americans did not display their power through words or threats, but through presence. This armada represented only a fraction of their total force, yet it surpassed everything Japan had ever possessed." General Umezu, standing beside him, noticed another detail: the symbolism of the ship itself. "We surrendered aboard a battleship built in less time than it took us to plan a single operation," he remarked quietly. The Missouri was one of dozens, constructed while they fought across 2 oceans and built weapons that defied imagination. We prepared for war for 10 years. They prepared for 15 months and buried us. When the American occupation began later that month, Japanese military observers finally saw with their own eyes what reports had long tried to tell them. A single U.S. infantry division arrived with more trucks than the entire Imperial Army owned. Supply convoys brought fresh food daily: meat, vegetables, even ice. Japanese soldiers who had survived on rice and salt watched, wordless, as American kitchens fed thousands. Their medical units carried equipment Japan's doctors had never seen. Wounded men who would have been left to die under Japanese care walked again within weeks. In September 1945, Colonel Hideaki Sato, the same intelligence officer who had presented the reality assessment a month earlier, completed his final report. Its title was as stark as its content: "Why We Lost." The first line read, "We lost the war in December 1941 when we attacked an enemy we did not understand." Every battle after that, he wrote, had been merely the unfolding of inevitable mathematics. American industrial strength exceeded Japan's by factors of 10 to 20 in every measure: aircraft, ships, fuel, steel, even food. And yet, beneath that cold arithmetic, there was a quiet dignity in the way the record closed. The empire that had risen through fire and iron now fell into silence, its leaders forced to confront truths they had long denied. The sound that lingered after surrender was not the echo of guns, but something smaller, the rhythmic slap of waves against the hulls in Tokyo Bay, a quiet heartbeat of history marking the end of an age. Their scientific establishment was larger than our entire educated population. That realization, stark, mathematical, and impossible to deny, echoed through every conversation in the months following Japan's surrender. Their resources were limitless, while ours were borrowed from lands we could no longer hold. For years, we had fought believing that spirit could overcome material, that devotion and sacrifice could somehow bridge the abyss between what we had and what the Americans could produce. We were wrong, fatally wrong. When the American Occupation Administration, led by General Douglas MacArthur, began sharing data with Japanese officials about U.S. war production, those numbers hit like a second kind of bomb, silent, clean, but just as devastating. The figures told a story more crushing than any battlefield defeat. The United States had produced 88,410 tanks, 257,000 artillery pieces, over 2 million trucks, 17 million rifles, and more than 41 billion rounds of ammunition. The mind could scarcely hold such numbers, but the detail that struck hardest was this. They had done it all while maintaining civilian living standards higher than Japan had known, even in peacetime. Former Prime Minister Suzuki, now a humbled man speaking under occupation supervision, put into words what Japan's leaders had at last come to understand. "We thought," he said slowly, "that we were fighting a nation of merchants, men who valued profit over honor, comfort over sacrifice. We were catastrophically wrong. We were fighting the most productive civilization in human history, one that could sustain a consumer economy and a total war machine at the same time. They did not choose between butter and guns. They produced both, in quantities we could not even imagine." For Japan's scientists, the most humbling revelation came later, when details of the Manhattan Project began to emerge. Through the quiet, careful sharing of information by occupation officials, they learned what it had taken to create the weapon that had ended their war. The project had employed 130,000 people. It had cost more than $2 billion, more than Japan's entire military budget for 1944. The facilities required to make it work consumed more electricity than some of Japan's largest cities combined. They were not mere laboratories, but entire industrial ecosystems built from the ground up in secret. Places like Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, each a small city devoted entirely to the physics of annihilation. And then there was the science itself. Theoretical physics operating at levels that Japan's best minds had never even conceived as reachable. To men who had built aircraft by hand and refined engines through trial and error, the idea that their enemy could split the atom with precision mathematics and industrial discipline was almost beyond comprehension. The atomic bomb, they realized, was not simply a weapon. It was a statement, the physical proof of a civilization's capacity to combine science, industry, and willpower into something godlike. Admiral Seimu Toyoda, in his 1946 written testimony for occupation historians, expressed what many officers had come to understand in silence. "We began the war believing that American democracy made them weak," he wrote, "that their diversity would divide them, that their wealth made them soft. But we ended the war, realizing that democracy gave them innovation, diversity gave them talent, and wealth gave them power. Every assumption we held was not merely wrong, it was precisely backward." For some, that understanding came too late to bear. Men like General Korichika Anami, whose devotion to the code of the warrior left no room for life after such a defeat, chose death rather than living with the weight of their misjudgment. Others, like Admiral Yonai, turned in the opposite direction, advocating total demilitarization, arguing that Japan's obsession with martial virtue had blinded it to reality. But for most, the reckoning was quieter, more inward. They were left struggling to reconcile the image of themselves as warriors, noble, disciplined, spiritually superior, with the hard truth that they had led their nation into an unwinnable war built on self-deception. Under the watchful eyes of occupation authorities, Japanese historians began piecing together how that deception had taken root. The trail led through archives, memos, and coded telegrams through the bureaucratic machinery of denial. They found that accurate reports from intelligence officers had been ignored or rewritten. Assessments warning of America's vast production capacity were labeled defeatist. Scientists who raised alarms about American research in nuclear or radar technology were silenced for undermining morale. Each department, each layer of command, had filtered reality until only optimism remained. The truth, one historian wrote, had become treason. It was a system built on faith, and faith, untested by reason, had become lethal. When the tide of war turned, rather than confronting reality, Japan's high command demanded more spirit, more sacrifice, more purity of intent. The harder the facts became, the more fiercely they believed in illusion. And by the end, belief itself had consumed them. Perhaps the most bitter truth came only after the occupation began. American officers, with polite efficiency, shared production data that revealed something the Japanese had never dared to consider. The United States had not even mobilized its full strength. The arsenal that had crushed the Axis powers, that had fought across the Atlantic and Pacific simultaneously, had been built with vast reserves still untouched. They had fought a global war while developing next-generation weapons, maintaining training programs, and planning for future conflicts beyond this one. The atomic bombs, devastating as they were, had not been America's maximum effort. They were merely proof of what could be done, while the rest of the machine kept running at full speed. For Japan, that revelation was almost metaphysical in its cruelty. The empire had thrown everything into the fire, every man, every ship, every ounce of fuel, and still found itself outmatched by an enemy that had never broken a sweat. American soldiers had fought with comfortable margins, never desperate, never starving, never short of ammunition. They could lose planes by the hundreds and replace them by the weekend. Japan's soldiers fought with the totality of their being, while their enemy fought with options. By 1947, when occupation authorities conducted formal interviews with surviving members of Japan's military leadership, that understanding had become universal. There was no longer defiance, no pretense of misunderstood nobility, only reflection. General Yoshijiro Umezu's statement, recorded that year, distilled the truth into words as sharp and clear as a blade. "We lost because we never understood our enemy," he said. "We ascribed to them our own weaknesses, limited resources, narrow industry, rigid thinking, when they possessed the opposite. We believed our propaganda when we should have believed our intelligence. The atomic bomb was not the cause of our defeat. It was the final proof of a defeat that had begun the moment we attacked an enemy we did not comprehend." He paused, then added something that historians would later underline as the epitaph of an age. "We learned too late that courage cannot defeat chemistry, that spirit cannot overcome steel, and that determination means nothing when your enemy possesses both, and 10 times your capacity to give that determination form." When Umezu finished speaking, the room was silent. The interpreter hesitated before translating, as if words alone were inadequate to carry the weight of what had been said. Outside, Tokyo was rebuilding, cranes and scaffolds where once there had been ruins. The war was over, but its lessons were just beginning to take shape. And in that quiet, between the fall of one empire and the birth of another era, you could almost hear the echo of those words fading into history, like the last tremor of a distant explosion carried on the wind.